to do something that is different. And you look at all the heroes, and that's what they do.
The commitment to listen with the same passion with which we want to be heard.
In terms of who do you want to be, articulate that. Find the words behind that. Who do you want to be?
Welcome to another episode of the DNA of Purpose podcast. Today, we will be delving into a topic that I believe is critical for any purpose-driven leader or entrepreneur, and that is the need for increased funding for underrepresented and underestimated startup founders. Despite possessing a wealth of innovative ideas reflective of their diverse experiences and diverse backgrounds, these founders face significant challenges. They not only struggle to access networks and resources, but also contend with biases that underestimate their expertise and potential for success. Now, this disparity in funding, where Black, Latino, and women entrepreneurs receive only a fraction of venture capital compared to their white male counterparts, not only perpetuates social inequalities, but also hampers innovation and economic growth. Urgent action is required to address this pressing issue and also to unleash the untapped potential of underrepresented founders. That is why today I am thrilled to introduce Joey Mak, the CEO of Chicagoland. Chicagoland is a nonprofit organization working to advance diversity, equity, and inclusion in Chicago's venture capital and startup community. They measure the VC diversity gap, help underrepresented professionals secure VC jobs, and are building a growing community of investors who share in the commitment to improving the industry. Now, today, Joey and I embark on a journey through the critical landscape of diversity, equity, and inclusion in venture capital. We also explore the personal narratives driving this mission, dissect the challenges hindering inclusive cultures, and highlight the imperative role diversity plays in investment decisions, plus so much more. Welcome to another episode of the podcast. Beaming into the studio, Joey Mak, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you for having me, Rebecca. I'm excited about our conversation today.
I'm really excited about our conversation as well and ready to dive into the first question, which happens to be a question that I ask all of our guests on the podcast. What I would love to know is, what question are you currently pondering, thinking about? It might be keeping you up at night, that is currently guiding your work forward?
Well, the question that's keeping me up at night is, how do we get more capital deployed to underrepresented founders and entrepreneurs? In the US, less than 5% of all venture capital funding goes to women, Black, and Latino founders combined. And that has huge implications in which companies are being formed and which products and services are being launched. You know, we live in a dynamic society that is growing increasingly diverse. That's certainly the case here in Chicago, which is where I live and work. And I think that as we look to the future and think about the changing and evolving needs of the consumer market, businesses and startups need to be responsive to that. But that's going to be really hard when a big part of the population isn't represented among those founders and entrepreneurs who are being funded.
Gosh, such important work in the world, Joey. And I'm going to dive into many questions over the course of today's conversation in order to be able to unpack that further with you. However, for now, I'd like to understand a little more about your personal journey. Now, I know from doing a little bit of research that you grew up in Chicago as the son of Cambodian refugees who were fleeing war and genocide. I personally have such a soft part in my heart for Cambodia, having spent a fair bit of time there over the years. And so, look, Joey, I'm really curious to understand, what was it like growing up within that context, and how did those earlier experiences really catalyze and inform your purpose in the world today?
Absolutely. And you'd mentioned a little bit, and I'd love to just add a little more color about my family's history and journey, because that directly impacted, my life's work and the work I'm doing now. So, as you mentioned, I'm the son of Cambodian refugees. My parents lived through the genocide that occurred there in the latter half of the 70s. In the early 80s, they emigrated here to the United States, landed in Chicago, and I was born a few years later. I grew up here in the US. I was born here in the US, but as the child of immigrants, especially the child of immigrants who were escaping war and genocide, that shadow of genocide definitely loomed large. And it was something that was ever present, and we grew up in Chicago, moved out to the north suburbs of Chicago. So, growing up, I went to predominantly white schools. So oftentimes I was the only person of color, the only person with immigrant parents. And, when you feel that type of otherness, it certainly impacts the way you view the world. And, I don't want to paint some sad story. I was privileged in many ways too. Grew up in a household with two parents who were very loving, who valued education, and certainly I benefited from that. But when you don't see others around you who look like you, or who have similar stories, you it's very easy to think that the world wasn't built for you. And it really wasn't until later in life, when I was able to meet other folks from all walks of life, that I was able to really understand and find my place in the world. I think why that's relevant is because when we think about business and we think about how products and services are launched, when the full breadth of a society isn't at the table to help inform what those products and services are, you end up with a lot of products and services that weren't built for a lot of the consumers. And I was mentioning earlier that we live in an increasingly diverse world, and I think those businesses that are able to adapt and understand changing, evolving consumer preferences, those are the ones that are going to be able to survive and really thrive. So that has always been something that I've kept in the back of my mind as I've approached work. Now, a lot of my background over the past 20 years has been in community and economic development. So there's always been kind of a do-good aspect to my work. But I've always, interacted, engaged with entrepreneurs, founders in some capacity. And it's a common refrain that I hear from founders and startups, especially women, non-binary, underrepresented founders, which is it's so impossible to raise capital. It's so difficult to get access to capital, even when they've got a great business that's generating revenue. And there are a lot of reasons for that. And I think we'll probably unpack some of those today.
Yeah, absolutely. I definitely want to dive in. However, I think it's really important before we go further into the conversation to really clearly define exactly what it is we are talking about when we use the terms diversity, equity, and inclusion. Now, as the CEO of Chicagoland, I'm sure you spend a fair bit of time framing this up for people. So yeah, I'm wondering if I could invite you to really clearly define what we mean when we use those terms.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think these terms, or the acronym DEI, often gets conflated, but they refer to very specific things. So I appreciate the question. So first, diversity, that really refers to representation. And if we look at it in the business world, it refers to representation in the workforce. What proportion of your employee base are women or non-binary or men? Right. So diversity has a lot to do with kind of the numbers aspect. And this is where I think a lot of businesses tend to focus on because it's the easiest thing to measure. You can see it, you can measure it, right? Equity, on the other hand, is something a little different. Equity really refers to how people are treated in the workplace. It's about ensuring that there are common policies, practices, norms that dictate things like who gets hired, who gets a promotion, who gets access to opportunity. So it's about fairness, it's about equity of opportunity. And inclusion, the I in DEI, is really about how employees experience their workplace. It's very much a verb. It's about the degree to which organizations embrace their employees and enable employees to be their authentic selves in the workplace, while also contributing to the organization as a whole. So when you take these things collectively, diversity, equity, and inclusion, again, they're somewhat distinct concepts, but they're actually not very radical concepts either. These are actually just really good business practices that help to ensure that you're building a really resilient organization.
And do you feel that organizations are getting this right?
Some organizations do, many others do not. And as I mentioned earlier, a lot of organizations, they will tend to focus on, the first aspect, the D of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Let's hire more women, let's hire more people of color into our organization. But if you're not paying attention to those other aspects about how those new hires are experiencing their organization, about how they feel when it comes to being able to access opportunities, when it comes to being able to access mentorship, when it comes to seeing other leaders who look like them, you set yourself up for a lot of attrition. And that's why it's really not surprising that, in the last couple of years, there's been this rise of chief diversity officers. But oftentimes those chief diversity officers don't last very long, because if you hire someone and then put all the burden on them to figure this whole thing out, pretty soon, unless they are embedded into the strategy of the organization, unless they have a seat at the table when it comes to making decisions, it's really just virtue signaling. It's really just hiring someone for the sake of hiring. And I don't think that goes over well for organizations. And unfortunately, too many organizations take that easy way out, whereas kind of embracing diversity, equity, and inclusion as a framework, it takes time, it takes sustained effort. It's not a series of checkboxes.
Yeah, it's such an important distinction. It's got to be something that comes from right from the middle of the organisation, from an organisational transformation perspective.
Exactly.
Let's pause for a moment. If you're listening to this podcast, chances are you have been inspired by some of the world's most purpose-driven pioneers. Have you ever considered that you could be one? Have you ever contemplated expanding your influence through speaking engagements, writing a book, or launching a podcast, but you have no idea where to start? Well then, the Ignite consulting process is your key to unlocking a purpose-driven personal brand and thought leadership strategy. Since 2014, my work has been to empower high-impact leaders to emerge as trailblazing authorities in a purpose-driven economy by accelerating their influence to create a better world. To book a discovery call, click the link in the show notes.
In terms of Chicago Blend, you have chosen to, work in the space in between diversity and venture capital, which you've already mentioned this morning. I'm really curious to know, given the number of areas you could have chosen to diversify, what specific challenges within the startup ecosystem drew you in, compelling you to address them through your work with Chicago Blend?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, we tend to focus on diversity among venture capitalists because our whole thesis is if we can create more diversity among investors, we'll start to see more diversity among founders who are being funded, right? And the reason we focus on VCs and why it was really interesting to me personally is because venture capitalists play a major role in determining which ideas, which products, and which innovations are going to shape the modern economy. And if you think about the biggest companies today, the companies that are listed on the Dow Jones or the NASDAQ, most of those companies started out with venture capital backing, so we know that VCs play an outsized role in shaping the future in so many ways. And when we don't have diversity among the investing class, what does that mean? Number one, that means less funding for underrepresented entrepreneurs. I mentioned earlier, less than 5% of all VC funding in 2022 went to women, Black, Latino founders in the US combined. And what does that mean? That means missed market opportunities, because we know that diverse teams are just better equipped to understand the evolving needs of an increasingly diverse consumer market. There are also negative social and economic impacts that are associated with a lack of diversity in venture capital. It deepens the wealth gap because it means limited opportunities for overlooked startup founders to get the capital they need to grow and scale and hire from their communities. And also, it leads to a lot of potential reputational harm. This negative public perception, reputational damage for organizations that lack diversity. In Chicago, we spend a lot of time measuring diversity across the entire venture ecosystem. And I can tell you that according to our most recent data, across Chicago's 130 or so venture capital firms, only 1 in 20 partners are Black or Latino, and only 1 in 7 partners are women. And, even though we're starting to make some progress in the right direction, this lack of diversity tends to reinforce itself over and over. And that's why I was really drawn to this problem, because, this is really where the root of so many missed opportunities starts. I think when we look across the entrepreneurial ecosystem, certainly here in Chicago, there's so many programs to support underrepresented, overlooked founders and entrepreneurs. But there really isn't a lot of focus on those who are making investment decisions. And I think when we talk about trying to diversify tech, diversify the startup ecosystem, we need to look at both sides of the equation, the funding side and the founder side.
Absolutely. I imagine, Joey, that you have seen some incredible stories in relation to the ideas that have got funded by unrepresented founders. I'm just wondering if I can invite you to share like a case study. Do you have any stories of businesses that have really gone well off the back of your work with Chicagoland?
So I was just talking to an entrepreneur last night. We were at a holiday party, and he had mentioned that he was launching a line of sunscreen, Black entrepreneur. And the reason why it was so exciting is, as someone who has darker skin myself, a problem that I deal with all the time is when I use sunscreen, it kind of leaves this pasty white film on my skin, and it's not attractive. I kind of look like Casper the Ghost, right? So he was he's in the process of launching this sunscreen line, and in a very short period of time, he's already made huge traction in Europe. They're getting ready to launch here in the United States, just awaiting some FDA approvals. But it's been so encouraging to see how much traction he's been able to have in a short period of time, because this is really an unmet need in the skincare sunscreen market, right? And so, just personally speaking, I can tell you, like, this is a product that I would buy. And if you think about others who have that unique perspective, who are able to hone in on how different consumer products or different services are not currently meeting their needs, that's really where some really cool innovation happens. And it also presents an incredible investment opportunity for investors, venture capitalists who are, willing to kind of go out of their traditional circles to find entrepreneurs like this.
Yeah, no, I love that story. And I think it really does point to the opportunity of really embracing diversity by design in relation to, of course, in your case, the ideas and the people that you're investing in. But just more broadly speaking, the ability to be able to harness different perspectives, different backgrounds, different cultures in relation to product design and development. I mean, you've just shared a really good example of how that can present brand new opportunities in the marketplace.
If you allow me to just share another example.
Yeah, I'd love that. I think these human stories are great because it brings diversity and inclusion to life.
Definitely, and
Yeah.
I use an example of sunscreen, but I'll use another example that I heard last night. So, at Chicago Blend, we have a fellowship program for underrepresented folks who are trying to break into venture capital, and as part of our capstone for this 4-month program, our fellows, they get up in front of a room of investors and they give these TED style talks about a VC trend or a tech trend or insight that's really interesting to them. It's kind of an opportunity for them to flex their muscles and their expertise. One of our fellows was talking about the critical need for childcare, especially for parents who are working in startups, because oftentimes when you're raising a small child, especially before they're of school age, parents, especially women, end up taking themselves out of the workforce and they're taking time away from building, right? The figure that she came up with was, at least here in the United States, the opportunity cost of not having women and parents of young children fully participate in the US economy was estimated at something like $130 billion worth of missed opportunity, because we have people who would otherwise be building companies, innovating, launching new products and services, who aren't able to do that because they're busy caring for their child. And here in the United States, childcare is prohibitively expensive. It's very difficult to find quality childcare. We don't really have good national policies to support working parents in this way. But this is what I mean when we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion. It's not just about race and gender. It's about people who are at different stages in their life, people who have different experiences. And, if we are able to solve this problem to enable more working parents to participate in the innovation economy, that can mean so many things, can have such huge implications for the overall economy and our ability to launch even better, more novel products and services.
So, Joey, another aspect of your work with Chicago Blend is helping underrepresented professionals secure VC jobs. Now, as much as this podcast is about inspiring entrepreneurs and startups, it's also really about arming leaders with the tools to be able to really redirect big corporations. So what I'm really curious to know is, and we've sort of touched on this a little bit already in the conversation, but what is your approach or advice to corporate leaders who want to create more diverse and inclusive cultures, and where should they begin? Now, I know we already kind of said that this needs to be more than kind of a tokenistic effort. It needs to be something that really comes from the inside out of an organization, and that it needs to be, I guess, nurtured and nourished and maintained in terms of looking after an organization's capital, like human capital. So I'm wondering what else is involved there for corporate leaders?
Yeah. When you're talking to corporate leaders and asking them, what are you doing, or how do you build a more diverse and inclusive culture in your company, it can be a really daunting question for any leader, especially a leader that doesn't have a lot of experience with that, right? And I think that's sometimes the wrong question. I think a more productive starting point for any leader is just to ask yourself, what business challenges am I dealing with right now? Because whether you are trying to find new customers, whether you're trying to penetrate new markets, whether you're trying to retain your employees or develop new products, there is something within the diversity, equity, and inclusion toolbox that could be applied to help you achieve your business goals. So I think it really comes down to business strategy and goal setting, and then taking the learnings of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And there's a ton of information that's out there, tons of great frameworks that are out there, and applying those frameworks to your company. Because ultimately, this isn't about, well, we need to focus on DE&I because everyone else is, or we need to check off that box. It's really about creating a more resilient organization, creating a stronger workforce that will ultimately enable you to create better products and services, to be a better corporate leader, and ultimately generate higher returns for investors. So when people ask, where do I start? I just kind of turn the question back on them, which is, well, what challenges are you dealing with right now? What are you trying to solve? And let's see what within the DEI toolbox can be applied. hiring is certainly a big component, especially when we think about the diversity aspect of that. But one other very simple thing that I think a lot of HR leaders are starting to get much smarter with is rethinking not just their hiring practices, but even rethinking simple things like job descriptions, especially at the early stages. Because, something that I see a lot of startup companies doing when they're, hiring for a marketing manager, a social media manager, whatever the case may be, they will go to Google, they'll search for a job description, kind of copy, paste, and then kind of edit it, put it out there and hope that they get resumes. And, hopefully when they see the right resume, they'll know the right candidate when they see it, right? That's really not the best way to go about it. Instead, there are lots of different ways that, when you write a job description where there might be lots of bias that's kind of woven throughout that job description. And so you really have to be vigilant about that. I've read about this and I've heard this many times from HR leaders, which is oftentimes women will not apply for a job unless they are confident that they meet every single qualification that's listed on that job description. Men, on the other hand, they'll apply for a job if they only have 50% of those boxes checked, right? So you have to think about, what information are you communicating when you're hiring? And is that really the message that you want to put out there? Because you might be inadvertently icing out a lot of people from, otherwise opting in and throwing their name in the ring. So, looking at job descriptions and really thinking of diversity, equity, and inclusion as a set of tools to help you achieve your business goals, I think is a much more productive place to start. And it makes it much more tangible for business leaders too.
Yeah, I love how practical your advice is. And, something as simple as looking at the job description. I can really relate to that when I think back over the years when I've applied for jobs. And it is true, like you're kind of reading through, and if you've got this long list of things that kind of take you out of the game, then you're not going to apply. And as a recruiter, you're losing all of this potential opportunity and all of these amazing people just because of how you've written something. So I love how practical your advice is there, Joey. So what I want to dive into now is I want to talk about the white elephants. Let's talk about some of the things that maybe people don't like to talk about in relation to diversity and inclusion. What are some of the things that you find leaders are worrying about or are concerned about in relation to how they go about this?
Yeah, I think something that has been really challenging, at least here in the United States, is we don't have a healthy way of talking about issues of race. And certainly not in the workplace. This is always something that lots of folks it's a hard topic. It makes people uncomfortable. And as a result, for lots of folks, it's just much easier to not talk about it.
Yeah.
And I think that is something that we really need to just be comfortable being uncomfortable, because in a country like the United States, just like in any diverse society, there's a lot of history that's embedded. There's a lot of things to unpack. Lots of heated emotions, rightfully so. But I think we need a healthier way to talk about issues of race, and something that is something that I think business leaders will often do, especially if they're not comfortable doing it, is just avoid the topic altogether out of a fear of saying the wrong thing. But I think as we look at how the workforce is evolving, especially with Gen Z, and pretty soon Gen Alpha will be entering the workforce, I think younger generations are very curious to understand what leaders in their organizations think. And I think that provides an opening for leaders to maybe be a little bit more vulnerable, for leaders to invite in others, experts who have more experience talking about these things, facilitating conversations in a healthier way, for whether it's employees or even just amongst friends, to be able to get comfortable, to build up that vocabulary, vocabulary, that muscle memory, so that you can start talking about these issues. Because I think the longer that we go as a society without talking about race and what that means in our workplace and how that impacts different segments of our workforce, the longer we go without talking about it, the more these cleavages are going to crystallize, right? And I think DEI is really meant to unpack a lot of that, is to remove a lot of those barriers so that organizations can start to move more harmoniously.
Yeah, and I can't help but feel that safety and trust are just paramount in this conversation, because you've got of course you've got the side of underrepresented people, but then you've also got the other half who are represented, but then, as you've just said, don't know how to tackle these conversations for fear of saying something wrong or doing something wrong. And it's really about coming back together and really creating a foundation of safety and of belonging where everybody can openly discuss these things and create the best solutions moving forward.
Absolutely.
So, Joey, I came across a Forbes article emphasising diversity as the holy grail of venture capital, attributing challenges to societal biases. And it also suggested that the diversity of those making investment decisions is also a key factor. I'd like to delve into these two aspects. Firstly, let's have a bit of a chat about unconscious bias. What I'm really curious to understand is, how does unconscious bias contribute to the perpetuation of a lack of diversity and equity in potential investments? And can strategies be implemented to overcome this challenge?
Yeah, and I'll use the example within venture capital because obviously that's what I'm paying a lot of attention to. But just from a human perspective, humans have a tendency to associate with, work with, fraternize with other people who look like them, who talk like them, who come from similar backgrounds. It's a natural thing, and I don't think that's necessarily good or bad. It just is, right? Where it becomes a problem is when that tendency to associate with people like you, if you will, when it starts to creep into business, when it starts to creep into investment decisions, when it starts to creep into decisions around who gets hired. And that's where, as business leaders, we all have to kind of check ourselves to ensure that we're not allowing those things to get the better part of our judgment, So as an example, oftentimes in venture capital, there are a lot of it's a very network driven industry. A lot of investors will hire from a certain set of schools. Maybe they went to Harvard Business School, so that's where they're going to go. They're going to tap that alumni network when hiring other folks to work on their investment team. They may also tap that same network to find other investment opportunities, other founders, right? And while that may generate some returns, when you kind of repeat that pattern over and over again, you set yourself up for really just limiting your perspective on who to hire, who to invest in, to a very limited number of people, So that's really what unconscious bias is. And you see that all the time in business, and you certainly see that in venture capital. So how do you kind of break that cycle? Number one is to, take the time, make the effort to talk to folks who are from different backgrounds, to look different from you, who have different experiences, and it's usually when you are talking to people with different diverse experiences where some really, innovative ideas can form and where you can maybe look at the world in a different way. So from that perspective, variety is the spice of life, right? And going out of your way to build new relationships, whether it's for, sourcing deal flow, whether it's for hiring, can definitely help you expand your pool and expand your network. But the other thing is about, again, setting up those processes, those norms. This kind of goes to the equity piece of diversity, equity, and inclusion. There's one venture capital firm here in Chicago. They have a very strict rule that they don't, when assessing deal flow and looking at companies, they don't accept warm introductions. They require every single founder to go through the same front door. They have a common application where you fill out information information about your company, what you're doing, how much you're trying to raise, and then they will assess each of those companies based on the merit, as opposed to being like, hey, we went to college together, you should check out my friend's company, I don't know that we're ever going to, as an industry, break ourselves from, world warm introductions. But I think that is just an example of a way where, you can provide opportunity to a broader set of founders, a broader set of people, and ultimately grow your pool. Again, whether it's of candidates, of deal flow, whatever the case may be, to grow your networks. And ultimately, that's what it's going to take in order to break yourself from that unconscious bias. It requires conscious, intentional effort.
So let's talk about the other side of the coin, that being the diversity of the investors themselves. Given that in the current landscape, we pretty much have a predominance of white privileged men in terms of investor circles. So I'm wondering what approaches can be employed to foster more diversity in the investor community?
Yeah, and I touched on this a moment ago, but I think a lot of it comes to who are you hiring and where do you go to hire from? As I mentioned earlier, Chicago Blend, we have a fellowship program for underrepresented, aspiring venture capitalists who are trying to break into the industry. And we're very proud of the fact that since launching this program in 2022, more than 80% of our fellows who applied for venture capital jobs ultimately landed a role in venture post-program. And, I think part of the reason we've had that success is because we've, at least here in Chicago, been able to build credibility among the local VC firms. So this is where a little bit of that, credibility, the network-driven piece of the industry actually works to our advantage, right? Because we are helping to train, the next generation of venture capitalists. So to some degree, they've been vetted already, right? There are so many incredible programs and fellowships across the country that are churning out really great, diverse talent. So my advice to firms that are trying to diversify their ranks, trying to bring in new diverse perspectives, is to check out the talent pipeline that's coming from these various programs. It's to reach out to, historically Black colleges and universities, for example, here in the United States, to see, to build a relationship with those recruiting officers at those campuses, so that you're getting a first look at the new talent that's graduating out of those universities. Again, it requires intentional effort, but VCs are incredibly good at networking. So it's really just, taking that networking to another level, because, something that we've heard for many years is, oh, I would love to hire a woman, or I'd love to hire someone who's Black to join my team. I just don't know where they are. And I think what we're demonstrating through our program, but lots of other organizations are doing this as well, is that the talent is out there. The pipeline is there. For anyone who's willing to take the time to take a look at those pipelines.
So, Joey, let's dive into the world of technology. Now, we've already spoken a little bit about unconscious bias, and I'm sure that this may be an overlay to my next question. Considering the influence of technology across all industries, especially with the rising prominence of generative AI in investments, it's apparent that technology is, really quite critical in regards to addressing some of the current challenges that we're facing. However, alongside its potential, there are other risks concerning the biases embedded in technology. How do you believe fostering diversity can play a role in ensuring the creation of technology that is truly inclusive and devoid of these biases?
It's so important to ensure that there are diverse voices at the table from the get-go before products and services are launched. Because when you have people with different perspectives at the table during the design process, you're more likely going to be able to catch those potential problems, especially for things like AI. There's the classic case of AI being really good at recognizing white faces, but not being as good at delineating between faces of color, So I think it's really important that, the reason why you need to have diversity at the table, it's not just because it's a good thing or, it feels good, but it can help companies when they're developing products forecast and predict where there are going to be blind spots so that you can address those before you release that to the market and ultimately build a better product that's going to serve a broader consumer market. And ultimately, I think that's what most companies are going to want to do when they're developing products. So, I think, more and more companies are getting better about this, but there are a lot of offenders that are still out there. And especially at the pace with which technology is transforming our lives and the pace with which it's being developed, we really need to make sure that there are lots of perspectives at the table to ultimately build better products that are going to serve humanity, serve society in a better way.
So, given I get to talk to a lot of incredibly intelligent people who are mostly right on the cutting edge of their field, such as yourself. So I'm really curious to know, are there any ideas that you're really excited about? Any trends, any disruptions in this space that you'd like to share?
There are two that I've learned about from the fellows that we serve through Chicagoland, and they just recently pitched this just the other night. So I want to share a little bit about what I've learned from our own fellows. Yeah. One is about the rising purchasing power of Gen Alpha. So these are individuals that were born roughly between 2010 and 2024. So they're anywhere from 1 to 14 years old right now. I think probably like a lot of your listeners, I definitely remember a time before smartphones, before the internet, at least the way that we understand the internet now. That's not the case with Gen Alpha. This is an entire generation of young people who are true digital natives. They were born with iPads and iPhones in their hand, knowing how to use it better than their parents. And what is so fascinating is even though they're young, they're not yet working, most of them are not yet working, Gen Alpha is poised to be the largest generation that's ever lived. And they're also going to be the most diverse generation that's ever lived. Additionally, their purchasing patterns, they have a lot of purchasing power, a lot of influence within their families, with their parents when it comes to what they want to buy. And the things that they're paying attention to are very different. They're not necessarily watching commercials on TV the way that I did when I was a little kid. They are looking at influencers. And, it's also, there's this shift with the role that influencers play in terms of marketing products. I think for a long time, influencers were seen as a conduit for brands to distribute their products and services. But now, especially Gen Alpha, the younger generations, they are much more keen on purchasing directly from influencers. So now influencers themselves are becoming the brand, so that is a huge shift in the consumer market that I think is going to really change the way that people buy things, especially as Gen Alpha matures and as they start to hit their 20s, as they start to enter the workforce and start to really start buying things. That's going to change the way that businesses have to interact with consumers. So that's a really interesting trend that we're paying attention to. Something else I learned from another one of our fellows was she was just illuminating where investment dollars are going when it comes to climate tech investments. Climate tech and the tools and technologies that are required to really address the climate crisis, it's very hardware intensive. It's very capital intensive. But the bulk of the investments, at least here in the United States, is going to climate tech software. And the truth is we need both, but there's this huge underinvestment in hardware, in kind of the physical tools and technologies that are needed to address this. So she was trying to make the case to this room of investors of why, climate tech investors ought to be looking at hardware as well. So I thought that was an interesting trend. And it sounds like we've got some catching up to do as an industry.
Yeah. So, Joey, we've come towards the end of our conversation today, but I am curious to know, is there anything that you feel would be important to share with our listeners that you haven't shared across the course of the conversation yet?
I just want to reiterate how important diversity, equity, and inclusion is in business, and the fact that it is not a series of checkboxes. This is really a business strategy that can help you, your company, accelerate and move forward. And I think when we stop thinking about it as something we have to do, like audits or financial statements, and start thinking about it as an opportunity, A, it becomes less scary, and B, the benefits of it become much clearer. So if I could leave your listeners with anything, it's just, rethink your understanding of DEI and what it can do for business.
So where can we find you? Where can we learn more about Chicago Blend and learn more about your work in the world?
Absolutely. To learn more about us, go to chicagoblend.org.
Joey Mak, it has been such a pleasure to have you on as a guest on the DNA of Purpose podcast. Thank you so much for joining me today.
It's been a lot of fun. Thanks, Rebecca.